13 months ago, the President of the United States went on television and told the world that Iran's nuclear program had been, in his exact words, completely and totally obliterated. Within 72 hours, an intelligence assessment produced by his own Defense Intelligence Agency reached a very different conclusion, that the strike had set Iran's program back by months, not years, months, 2 statements. Same event, same night, same bombs. And they cannot both be true. So which one was it? Because for 13 months, that question has been the single most important unanswered question in global security, and almost nobody has told you the actual answer. Not because it is classified, because it is complicated. And here is what makes this the story worth your next 20 minutes. We now know what the 30,000-pound bomb did to Fordow. We know it from satellite imagery, from the world's leading nuclear analysts, and from something Iran itself did in late July that gave the entire game away. And the answer is stranger, darker, and far more consequential than either side told you. If you want the version of this story that respects your intelligence, subscribe right now. This channel does not do headlines. It does the thing underneath the headline. And this one has been sitting in plain sight for over a year while everyone argued past it. Let us start with what Fordow actually was, because you cannot judge whether a bomb worked until you understand what it was fighting. Fordow sits near the city of Qom in central Iran, not on the ground, under it. The enrichment halls were buried somewhere between 80 and 90 meters beneath a ridge of limestone and rock. To put that in something you can actually picture, that is roughly the height of a 25-story building, except stacked downward in solid stone above the thing you are trying to hit. Iran did not build it that way for convenience. Building underground is slower, costs more, and creates enormous engineering problems around air, power, and water. Iran built it that way for exactly one reason, to make it unhittable. And here is the part most coverage skips entirely. The depth was not just about stopping a bomb, it was about stopping vibration. Because a centrifuge is not a rugged industrial machine. Think of it less like a factory press and more like a surgical instrument spinning at the speed of a jet engine turbine. A gas centrifuge separates uranium isotopes by spinning a rotor at tens of thousands of revolutions per minute, and at those speeds, the tolerances are brutal. A small tremor, a momentary power fluctuation, a shift of a few millimeters in the floor, any one of those can send a rotor into resonance and destroy it. And when centrifuges are linked in cascades, one failure can cascade into hundreds. So Iran was not only protecting the machines from a direct hit, it was protecting them from the shockwave of a near miss. 80 to 90 meters of rock does not just block a bomb, it absorbs energy, it swallows the shock. That was the bet. And for over 15 years, the bet held. Now, let us talk about the weapon that was built specifically to break it, because the GBU-57 is one of the most misunderstood objects in modern warfare. People hear 30,000 pounds, and they picture an enormous explosion. That is exactly backwards. The GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator is roughly 20 feet long, weighs about 30,000 pounds, and the overwhelming majority of that weight is not explosive. It is steel. A thick, precisely engineered casing built to survive slamming into rock at extreme velocity without shattering. Because the entire mission of this weapon is not to explode on a mountain. It is to survive going through one. Here is the logic. If a bunker buster detonates on impact at the surface, it has failed completely. All that energy vents upward into open air, where it does nothing but throw dirt. What the weapon has to do is stay intact through dozens of meters of stone, keep tracking its own depth as it travels through different densities of rock and rubble and void, and then detonate at the precise moment it reaches a depth where the blast can actually reach the target. Penetration first, detonation second. And that sequencing is a harder engineering problem than the explosion itself. The bomb is so heavy that only one aircraft in the entire American arsenal can carry it into combat, the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber, and only 2 per aircraft, carried internally because anything mounted externally destroys the stealth profile that makes the mission survivable. So, on the night of June 22nd, 2025, the United States executed Operation Midnight Hammer. 7 B-2 bombers flew from the continental United States across the Atlantic and the Mediterranean in near total radio silence. 14 GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators were dropped across 3 Iranian nuclear sites. More than 24 Tomahawk cruise missiles were launched from a submarine at additional targets. Roughly 125 aircraft were involved in total when you count the refueling tankers, the fighter escorts, and the decoy flights that went in the opposite direction, to pull Iranian attention off the real strike package. It became the largest B-2 mission in the history of the United States Air Force, and the first combat use of the GBU-57 ever. And of those 14 bombs, the overwhelming majority went to one target, Fordow. But here is the part that separates people who understand this operation from people who just watch the news coverage. They did not try to bomb through the mountain. That was never the plan. That was never possible. Think about it for 1 second. 80 to 90 meters of limestone above a hardened chamber and a bomb rated to penetrate roughly 60 meters of earth. The math does not close. Not with one bomb, not with 6. If the plan had been to punch a fresh vertical hole through the full thickness of that ridge, the mission would have failed before the first aircraft left the ground. So American planners did something far more surgical. According to the Institute for Science and International Security, which mapped the surface, cratering against captured plot plans of the facility and historical construction imagery, the bombing was precisely concentrated on 2 specific points of vulnerability. Not the mountain, the ventilation shafts. And this is where the entire story turns, because it is a lesson in how modern warfare actually works. Every underground facility on Earth has the same unavoidable weakness. It has to breathe. You cannot run thousands of heat-generating machines and staff a workforce inside a sealed granite chamber without moving enormous volumes of air in and out. That requires shafts. And a shaft, by definition, is a pre-existing hole running from the surface down toward the very rooms you're trying to protect. It is an engineered pathway through the armor. Here's the analogy that makes it click. Imagine trying to break into a bank vault with walls 3 meters thick. You do not attack the walls. You never attack the walls. You look for the ventilation duct, the cable conduit, the drainage pipe. The thing the architect had to include for the vault to function at all, that is your entry point. Fordow's designers built the strongest vault in the world and then, out of pure physical necessity, drilled 2 chimneys down into it. American analysts spent over a decade finding those chimneys, watching construction, measuring spoil piles, tracking where the cooling infrastructure ran, comparing satellite images month after month, year after year, until the invisible internal architecture of a mountain became a map. And on June 22nd, they dropped bomb after bomb into the same 2 narrow points in sequence, each one traveling further down the channel the previous one had opened. Not one big hit. A series of steel fists driving into the exact same wound, each going deeper than the last. And the physics of what happens next is genuinely counterintuitive. So let us take 1 minute on it, because it explains why this worked without needing to reach every room. In open air, a blast wave weakens fast. Pressure spreads outward in 3 dimensions and drops off sharply with distance, which is why you can survive an explosion that is far enough away. Underground, in a sealed system of rock and concrete and tunnels, the rules invert. The shock wave has nowhere to dissipate. It travels through the stone itself, reflects off hard boundaries, funnels down corridors, and slams into chambers it never physically entered. Think of the difference between shouting in a field and shouting inside a concrete stairwell. Same voice, completely different result. Because the enclosure that was supposed to protect the space is now amplifying everything inside it. So when multiple penetrators detonate at carefully staged depths along the same channel, those pressure pulses overlap and stack. Structural supports fail, ventilation systems shear, power conduits sever, blast doors buckle, and in the rooms where the cascades sit, you do not need the explosion to arrive. You only need the floor to move. Remember what a centrifuge is. A rotor at tens of thousands of RPM with tolerances measured in fractions of a millimeter. It does not need to be melted or crushed to be finished. It needs to be disturbed. A sudden loss of power alone can wreck a cascade. Contamination of the gas lines can wreck a cascade. A single hard tremor can send a rotor into destructive resonance and take out the hundreds of machines linked to it downstream. That is the cruel inversion at the heart of this entire strategy. And it is worth stating plainly. The deeper Iran buried Fordow, the more protection it bought against ordinary weapons. But the moment a specialized weapon found a genuine pathway inside, all of that surrounding mass stopped behaving like armor and started behaving like a hammer. The mountain that was the shield became the thing that transmitted the blow. Now, let us talk about what the satellites actually showed afterward, because this is where 13 months of argument began. The imagery revealed 6 distinct impact craters with clear evidence of multiple munitions striking the same precise points. It showed a dramatic change in the color of the mountainside, a gray-white discoloration spreading across a wide area, consistent with pulverized rock dust ejected and settled. It showed signs of subsidence, meaning the ground surface had sunk in places, which is the geological signature of underground voids collapsing beneath. It showed the access roads sheared and buried. It showed the tunnel entrances blocked, and that is where the visible evidence stops, cold. Because here's the problem that no amount of satellite technology solves. Everything that actually mattered at Fordow was under 90 meters of rock, and no camera in orbit can see through stone. Satellite imagery expert after satellite imagery expert said the same thing to reporters in those first weeks. Confirmation of below-ground destruction cannot be determined from pictures alone. The centrifuges were too deep. Which means every confident claim made in the first month of this story in either direction was an inference dressed up as a fact. But there is one piece of physical evidence that is not ambiguous at all, and it did not come from Fordow. It came from Natanz, roughly 100 kilometers away, hit on the same night. The Institute for Science and International Security did something clever with the Natanz imagery. Iran built the buried enrichment halls at Natanz years ago, and during construction, the excavation was visible from orbit, which means analysts had a historical imagery showing exactly where those halls sit underground. So they overlaid a construction-era image against a post-strike image, and what appeared in that overlay was a GBU-57 penetration hole positioned directly above the buried enrichment hall containing the installed centrifuge cascades, not near it, above it. That is not inference. That is a weapon arriving precisely where the machines were. The same reporting documented what happened to the supporting infrastructure. The on-site electrical systems powering the facility were destroyed, and in imagery captured months later, they remained destroyed and had not been repaired. Steam piping was wrecked, with debris scattered across the surrounding area. 19 HVAC chillers were cataloged at the site, and enrichment at scale simply does not run without cooling. And then Iran did something that tells you what it thought of its own position. It built roofs over the damaged buildings, new structures erected specifically to block overhead observation, because satellite imagery had become the only monitoring tool left after Iran barred inspectors. You do not spend resources hiding a facility you believe is fine. You hide the thing you do not want measured. Now here is the part of this story that never gets the credit it deserves, and it is not the bomb. It is the decade. There are no publicly available schematics of Fordow's interior. Nobody handed America a blueprint. Everything American planners knew about the internal architecture of that mountain was assembled from the outside over roughly 15 years by analysts doing the least cinematic work imaginable, comparing satellite photographs month after month, measuring the volume of spoil piles to estimate how much rock had been removed and therefore how large the internal chambers must be, tracking which access roads carried heavy equipment and when, watching where power lines terminated and where cooling infrastructure ran, because power and cooling betray the location of the machines they serve. Noting a new ventilation structure appearing on a slope, documenting a slight change in the grade of a hillside after a fresh excavation. Nobody makes a movie about that. There's no countdown clock, no dramatic score, no moment of revelation. It is people in a room quietly building a three-dimensional model of a hidden structure from the shadows it casts on the surface. And it is the reason the mission worked. The GBU-57 did not defeat Fordow. 15 years of patient attention defeated Fordow, and the GBU-57 was simply the instrument that collected on it. Iran's real mistake was not building too shallow. It was building something so important that it would be studied without interruption for a decade and a half, and then never moving it. And there is one more piece of evidence that cuts in a genuinely confusing direction. There was no radiological release. The International Atomic Energy Agency reported no increase in gamma readings around the site. Open-source nuclear monitoring networks recorded no anomalies. Now stay with me, because this single data point was used by both sides of this argument to prove opposite conclusions, and only one of those uses is honest. One camp said the absence of radiation proves the enriched uranium and the core processing systems were never destroyed, meaning the strike hit infrastructure and missed the substance. The other camp pointed out that this is precisely what nuclear engineers would expect even from a total kill, because uranium hexafluoride in a sealed underground chamber that collapses does not vent to the surface, it gets buried. And low-enriched and even highly enriched uranium is not the kind of material that produces a detectable plume from being crushed under a mountain. Both arguments are technically defensible, which is exactly why the absence of radiation resolved nothing at all. So the world was left with 3 official positions from the same government on the same night, and it is worth being precise about them because the differences are not spin, they are epistemology. Position 1. The president said the facilities were completely and totally obliterated. He said it before the B-2s had even landed. Position 2. General Dan Kane, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said the Air Force assessed that all 3 sites sustained extremely severe damage, and then added the sentence that everybody skipped past. Final battle damage will take some time. Position 3. A Defense Intelligence Agency assessment leaked within days and explicitly labeled low confidence suggested the strikes may have delayed Iran's program by months rather than years. Now here is what almost no one told you. All 3 of those statements can be simultaneously honest. The president was describing a political and strategic reality that the most protected nuclear facility on Earth had been struck and was no longer functioning. The chairman was describing what airborne sensors and initial imagery could support, which was severe damage with an honest caveat about certainty. And the DIA was answering a completely different question, not whether Fordow was destroyed, but how long before Iran can enrich uranium somewhere. Those are not the same question. A facility can be dead and a program can be alive. The entire public argument for 13 months has been people shouting different answers to different questions and thinking they were disagreeing. If this is the level of clarity you came for, hit the like button and subscribe right now, because the next part is the part nobody has put together for you. This is where we stop arguing and start looking at what Iran itself actually did. Because there is one form of evidence that is far more reliable than any government statement, any leaked assessment, or any satellite photo interpretation, and it is behavior. What a country does with a damaged facility tells you more than what anyone says about it. So watch what Iran did. In late July 2025, roughly a month after the strike, satellite imagery captured Iranian activity at Fordow. Heavy equipment, excavation, crews working at 2 specific locations, and those locations were precisely the sites of the GBU-57 penetration holes of the ventilation shafts. Analysts at the Institute for Science and International Security assessed this activity as Iran conducting its own damage assessment. Iran was doing exactly what you would do, going to the holes, digging in, and finding out how far down the American bombs actually reached. And then Iran walked away. That is the finding that answers the question. By November 2025, imagery of Fordow showed little to no significant new activity. The site had gone, in the Institute's own description, relatively dormant, not under reconstruction, not being repaired, not being cleared and restarted, dormant. Now think about what that means, because this is the single most important inference in the entire story. Iran had just spent 15 years and an enormous share of its national treasure building the most protected enrichment facility on the planet. It was the crown jewel of the program. If Iran's engineers had gone down those shafts and found that the cascade halls were intact, that the centrifuges had survived, that the damage was limited to entrances and ventilation infrastructure, there is no version of reality in which they abandoned that site. None. They would have cleared the shafts, restored power, and had Fordow spinning again within months, and they would have made absolutely certain the world knew it, because the propaganda value of surviving America's best weapon would have been immense. Iran did the opposite. It looked, and then it stopped. That is not the behavior of a government that found a working facility. That is the behavior of a government that went down into its own mountain, saw what the bombs had done, and concluded that Fordow was not worth rebuilding. The bomb worked. Let us be direct about it. On the specific question of whether the 30,000-pound bomb destroyed the Fordow enrichment facility, the accumulated evidence, including the corroborating penetration hole directly above the buried enrichment hall at Natanz, and Iran's own abandonment of the site, points to yes. The centrifuge halls at Fordow are, by every practical measure, finished. And that brings us to the second half of the answer, which is the half that should genuinely worry you. Because destroying Fordow and ending Iran's nuclear program were never the same achievement. Now let us talk about the material. Because the machine and the material are 2 completely different problems. Approximately 400 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% purity, verified by the IAEA before the strikes, remains unaccounted for. Not destroyed as far as anyone can verify. Unaccounted for. The best available assessment is that much of it lies buried under rubble at Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan, and Iran has not permitted a single IAEA inspector to set foot on any struck nuclear site since June 2025. The world's nuclear watchdog, the institution whose entire purpose is verification, has been reduced to studying satellite photographs like the rest of us. Here is why that matters more than the centrifuges did. Enriched uranium is the hard part. Enrichment is a brutal, expensive, decade-consuming industrial process, and 60% enriched material represents the overwhelming majority of the separative work required to reach weapons grade. Centrifuges are machines. Machines can be rebuilt, and Iran has demonstrated repeatedly that it can manufacture them domestically under sanctions. The uranium is different. That is 15 years of accumulated national effort, sitting in a set of canisters. Destroy a facility, and you have destroyed a building. Fail to account for 400 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium, and the clock has not been reset. It has been paused. And then there is the third thing the bomb could not touch, which is the knowledge. You cannot excavate expertise out of a mountain. The engineers who designed the cascades, the physicists who modeled the enrichment, the procurement networks that sourced components through a sanctions regime for 2 decades, all of that survived June 22nd, completely intact, because it lives in human beings and in documents and in institutional memory. Fordow was hardware. Hardware is the replaceable layer, which brings us to what the 30,000-pound bomb actually did in the fullest sense of that question. And the answer is not on any satellite image of Qom. It is on a mountain called Pickaxe, a mile south of Natanz. Because here's what happened next, and it is the most important consequence of Operation Midnight Hammer. Iran looked at the destruction of Fordow and drew a very specific engineering conclusion. Not that the program was impossible, that 80 to 90 meters was not enough. So in the months following the strike, Iran moved. Israeli and American officials, reported through the Wall Street Journal, assessed that Iran transferred thousands of uranium enrichment centrifuges into a tunnel complex bored into Pickaxe Mountain, at a depth estimated between 80 and more than 100 meters into solid granite. Deeper than Fordow, harder rock than Fordow, 2 pairs of hardened tunnel entrances, no IAEA access, ever, and the site has never been struck. in either the 2025 operation or the war that began this February. Read that back and sit with it. The most successful bunker-busting mission in the history of aerial warfare produced, as its direct consequence, a nuclear facility that is harder to bomb than the one it destroyed. That is not a failure of the mission. The mission did what it was built to do. It is something more uncomfortable than failure. It is the oldest pattern in military history repeating itself in real time. Castle walls were unbeatable until cannons arrived, so castles became star forts. Battleships ruled the sea until aircraft arrived, so navies built carriers. Every defense that gets defeated does not surrender. It adapts, and it adapts specifically to the thing that beat it. Fordow was Iran's answer to air power. Pickaxe is Iran's answer to the GBU-57. Now let us talk about the money, because the financial track of this story is the one almost nobody runs, and it reframes the whole thing. Fordow was not just a facility. It was a national investment on the scale of a major piece of civilian infrastructure, funded by a country under one of the most comprehensive sanctions regimes in the world, 15 years of excavation into a mountain ridge, thousands of precision centrifuges, each one manufactured domestically because Iran could not simply buy them, power infrastructure, cooling infrastructure, hardened entrances, security perimeters, an internal workforce, and the enormous overhead of concealment. Every dollar of that came out of an economy where ordinary Iranians were already dealing with inflation, currency collapse, and shortages of medicine and basic goods. And in one night, it was written off. Then, consider what came next. Moving thousands of centrifuges into Pickaxe Mountain is not a weekend operation. It is another multi-year, multi-billion-dollar construction and logistics program, boring deeper into harder rock, hardening a new set of tunnel entrances, and rebuilding all of the supporting systems from scratch. So the actual financial ledger of Operation Midnight Hammer reads like this. The United States spent an enormous amount on one night of aviation and 14 bombs. Iran lost 15 years of capital investment, and then immediately committed to spending again, deeper at a moment when its own citizens were being asked to ration electricity in 50-degree heat, and its government was warning that it might not be able to heat villages through winter. That is the part of the story the strategic debate keeps leaving out. Whatever the strike did or did not do to Iran's timeline, it imposed a staggering cost on a country that could not afford it, and the regime chose to pay that cost again rather than negotiate it away. That decision tells you something important about priorities in Tehran that no intelligence assessment can capture. It is also worth putting this moment in historical company because we are not the first generation to ask whether force can end a nuclear program, and the record is genuinely mixed. South Africa is the one clean success in the history of nuclear disarmament. It built functioning weapons and then voluntarily dismantled every one of them in the early 1990s. But that did not happen because anyone bombed South Africa. It happened because the entire political system was transforming simultaneously and reintegrating into the international community, and the weapons no longer served any purpose the new state recognized. Libya agreed to dismantle its program in 2003 under sustained pressure and negotiation, and then the region's politics shifted dramatically within a decade in ways that made every other regime study the outcome very carefully. North Korea signed framework after framework, accepted freezes, accepted inspections, and built and tested weapons anyway. The common thread across all three is not military. It is incentives. Programs end when the government running them concludes that stopping is worth more than continuing. Bombs can change that calculation, sometimes dramatically. But bombs alone have never once completed the job, because a program is not a building. It is a decision, renewed daily by people who are still alive after the smoke clears. Now here is the honest strategic assessment, and I'm going to give it to you without either flag draped over it. Militarily, Operation Midnight Hammer was a genuine historic success. A weapon was conceived, engineered, and delivered against the single hardest target class in the world, and it worked, at a depth, and against a design that the majority of independent experts had publicly doubted could be reached. Anyone who told you in June 2025 that Fordow was untouchable was wrong, and the record now shows it. Strategically, it bought time, and it changed the geometry of the problem, but it did not solve the problem, because the definition of success was set too high in public and measured too low in private. Obliterated was the wrong word, not because the damage was small, but because obliteration implies finality. And nothing about a nuclear program is final, while the material and the knowledge and the political will all survive. And psychologically, this is where the real cost sits. Iran learned the wrong lesson, or rather, it learned exactly the lesson you would expect. It did not learn that pursuing enrichment is futile. It learned that it needed to go deeper, disperse further, admit less, and let no inspector ever set foot on the ground again. Every one of those adaptations makes the next diplomatic solution harder and the next military option less certain. Now let us talk about the thing that has quietly become more dangerous than the bombing itself, which is the collapse of verification. Before June 2025, the international community had something genuinely valuable at Iran's nuclear sites. Not trust, measurement. IAEA inspectors physically walked into those facilities, counted centrifuges, took environmental samples, weighed and sealed canisters of enriched material, and installed cameras and seals that could detect tampering. That system was imperfect, and Iran obstructed it repeatedly, but it produced numbers. The reason anyone can say 440 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium with any confidence at all is that inspectors verified it before the bombs fell. Since June 2025, that entire apparatus has been gone. No inspector has entered a struck site. The seals are unmonitored. The cameras are unread. The stockpile is unweighed. And the world's nuclear watchdog has been reduced to the same tool available to any analyst with a subscription, which is commercial satellite imagery of the surface. Here is why that is the actual crisis. Uranium in canisters is small. 400 kilograms of metal sounds enormous until you picture it as the weight of a small car divided into portable containers, any one of which a few people could move in the back of a truck at night. Unlike a runway or a missile site or a construction project, moved uranium leaves almost no signature from orbit once it is underground or parked among ordinary industrial buildings. Satellites are excellent at watching trucks arrive. They are useless at telling you what was in the truck. So the honest state of knowledge, 13 months on, is this. We can say with reasonable confidence what happened to the machines, because machines live in buildings and buildings can be watched. We cannot say with any confidence what happened to the material, because the only tool that could ever have answered that question was a human being standing in a room with a scale, and that human being has not been allowed into the country since the night of the strike, which means the question in the title has a precise answer and an imprecise one sitting side by side. What the bomb did to Fordow, we know. What the bomb did to Iran's stockpile of enriched uranium, nobody outside Iran knows, and that is not going to change until inspectors are back on the ground. There is a human layer to this that deserves a moment, because it is easy to talk about mountains and megatons and forget who was actually down there. Somewhere under that ridge near Qom in the early hours of June 22nd, there were people, technicians on shift, engineers who had spent their careers in those halls. They did not know the name of the weapon above them. They did not know that analysts in another country had studied their ventilation shafts for over a decade, or that pilots had crossed an ocean in silence to reach them, or that computer models had already simulated the shockwave heading for the room they were standing in. All they knew, in a single instant, was that the ground moved in a way solid rock is not supposed to move. And on the other side of that equation, American engineers had spent years of their own careers solving the same problem from the opposite direction, going home to their families every night, having worked out how to make a mountain fail. Nobody in the story was a cartoon. The machines were cold. The motives never were. So let us bring it all the way back to where we started, to two statements that could not both be true. Except they were, both of them. Trump was right that Fordow was destroyed. The evidence, including Iran's own decision to abandon the site after inspecting the damage itself, supports that. The Defense Intelligence Agency was right that the program was set back by a shorter horizon than the political language implied, because the uranium was never accounted for, the expertise was never touched, and a deeper mountain was already being dug. The two statements were not contradictory. They were answers to two different questions, and the world spent 13 months treating them as a single argument because that is easier than holding two ideas at once. Here is the sentence that actually answers the question in the title. The 30,000-pound bomb destroyed a facility, exposed the limits of depth as a strategy, and simultaneously taught its target exactly how much deeper it needed to go. That is what it did. All three at once. And that is why Pickaxe Mountain is now the most dangerous piece of real estate on Earth, why an American president is publicly threatening to strike it, why independent experts are openly debating whether any existing weapon can reach 100 meters of granite, and why the war that started this February has still not answered the question that June 22nd was supposed to close forever. Fordow proved that no fortress is final. Iran's response was to build a deeper one, and somewhere in a Pentagon planning cell right now, engineers are running the same models they ran a decade ago, against harder rock, at greater depth, with less intelligence and a shorter clock. The mountain always loses eventually. The question this story leaves us with is whether anyone ever actually wins. So tell me what you think, because this one genuinely divides people. Do you believe the strike on Fordow made the world safer, or did it simply teach Iran to bury its program somewhere nobody can reach it? Drop your answer in the comments, and tell me where in the world you are watching from. And if this was the clearest breakdown of Fordow you have seen anywhere, hit that subscribe button before you go, because the sequel to this story is being written under a mountain right now, and you're going to want to understand it before it happens.